Stover graduated from the University of Delaware in 1989 with a bachelor's degree in civil engineering and from Cornell University in 1993 with a master's degree in environmental engineering. Captain Stover spent 18 years with IHS, working with tribes in New England, New York, Alaska, California, and Arizona, designing and managing construction of water and wastewater treatment facilities. Captain Stover came to EPA in 2011 to serve as the Indian Program Manager for EPA Region 1's tribal program. He continues to work with 10 federally recognized tribes in New England on critical environmental matters facing the tribal nations.
Thank you very much. Well, it's great to be here, and I want to first point to the title, which is very long, but my title is Restoring the St. John River International Watershed, Forging Cross-Border Partnerships with Tribes, First Nations, and US and Canadian federal agencies. And I really am privileged to do this presentation today and give this conference because our conference theme is about building better partnerships. And even if we, as we heard yesterday from a couple of the presentations, both at the Luther Terry lecture as well as our leadership, we heard a couple of quotes there that I think are really relevant and also are a good reason why I'd like to do this presentation today. But we heard we can't do public health without partnerships. We also heard there is power in partnerships. These are great quotes. And I'm also going to end with one other quote here from our own Admiral Deezer here, who says in his letter here to everyone, that I too believe that partnerships are key to substantive and sustained impact. So partnerships is what this is all about. Now, before we go into the actual partnership that I'm going to speak to, I do think it's important for us to talk a little bit about my story, because we all learn from each other, and I think that's one of the valuable aspects of coming to the conferences. We learn from each other. I first want to tell you about where I'm located. So I'm located, I serve the EPA out of Region 1, and that's in Boston, Massachusetts, or EPA New England as we call it. We work with 10 federally recognized tribes, and that's all the work that I do is to learn here. But we have 10 tribes throughout the 6 states of New England. And those New England states are Maine, New Hampshire, Connecticut, Rhode Island, Massachusetts, and Vermont. Now, my role within EPA is the Indian Program Manager. And as you heard in my introduction, I spent 18 years within Indian Health Service, Sanitation Facilities and Construction. The past 8 years is with EPA. So how many here are within IHS, from IHS? All right, and how many from EPA? So a good representation from both. So I have to say I did jump ship from IHS a number of years ago. But I have to say, it's not really a divorce, it's more a separation. Because I really felt like certainly IHS was a family, and I'm sure many of us in our respective agencies feel the same way. But what IHS did for me, as we heard in the comments from the Admiral, I felt going into this position, it really helped groom me to do this. And I say this in particular in light of the younger engineers here, when you're considering different career opportunities through the Public Health Service. My experience working with project management, my experience working with communities, my experience solving problems really helped me prepare for my current position within the EPA. So my role at the EPA as the Indian Program Manager is primarily fourfold. So first, I'm the key advisor to regional management. That includes the regional director, regional administrator for EPA, and also the office directors, which are the senior management. My experience, again, working with tribes, helps me to be a key role in that capacity. This is all from my PD. I'm the subject matter expert and regional lead representing the region on all tribal matters. Again, my experience working with Public Health Service, working in the field, and doing project management really helped me to be able to be a subject matter expert on so many different aspects of what we do with EPA. I'm also responsible for the direct implementation of EPA's 1984 Indian policy. And so that transposes into legal aspects, enforcement aspects, and also our trust responsibility with the tribes. And again, this has really been bolstered by my experience in the past. And finally, I am responsible for the oversight of all of the EPA programs that are administered in Indian country in New England. So that's consultation, that's grants management, infrastructure projects, and cleanup activities, to name a few. So through EPA, what I've been able to do is to really expand my horizons, working in all these different types of media programs, using the skills that I learned and transferring them over to my position that I've been doing for 8 years. And again, I say that to keep in mind for the young engineers, particularly as you consider other opportunities that are out there. And as you heard Admiral Deezer say earlier, starting with IHS really certainly helped me and groomed me for what I do now. So let's get to the project. I want to show you, introduce you where we are looking at. We are looking at a transboundary watershed. You see in the line here, if I can get this going here, this river here is called the St. John River. It's called the Ballistic in the Native American language. Beautiful flowing river. It starts in Canada. Well, the mouth of it is into the Bay of Fundy in Canada. It starts in western Maine, runs along, and it makes the border between Maine and Canada. And then it flows into Canada and out through the Bay of Fundy. We have two Native American tribes that reside within this area, the Aroostook Band of Micmacs and the Houlton Band of Maliseet Indians. And there they are located right across the border. Now, the political border, which was ironed out after the War of 1812, divided the families of these tribes. They both have counterparts in Canada. And as you can see here, the watershed of the St. John River is huge. It covers most of northern Maine, as well as a good part of New Brunswick and a little bit of Quebec. However, the political boundary divided the tribal communities. They all relied on the river. They all resided within the watershed. That's where their food came from. That's where their culture comes from. They hunted and fished and made their living along this river. Well, as the country grew, both countries grew, there was a lot of impacts on this river. There were impacts from the Industrial Revolution that created a lot of tensions between the countries, to the point where there needed to be a formal structure to deal with these disputes. And so a treaty was formed in 1909, the Boundary Waters Treaty, to deal with international disputes along waterways that bordered the entire country. And a commission was formed out of that to help deal with these disputes, the International Joint Commission. And that was formed to resolve these border disputes between the two countries. And it dealt with everything from water pollution to navigation issues and other water uses. So I'm so pleased to give this presentation because I'm going to give you a little bit of history with the public health service within the St. John River watershed. There was a lot of water quality impacts over the years to this watershed, starting with the logging. And then came the paper mills. And also it's a very agricultural community. There's a lot of potato starch factories that discharge right into the rivers. So lots of impacts to water quality, and not to mention the municipalities that also discharged into that area as well. This got to the point such that soon after that treaty was signed in 1909, a study was conducted to investigate these sources of pollution and the impacts in the river. So between 1914 and 1918, the International Joint Commission, they commissioned a study to investigate this issue of water quality and pollution in the St. John River. Those impacts primarily were on fisheries and on public health. Most of the communities relied on the river for drinking water. Tribes is included in that. So there's major impacts. And so a report was completed on this work. Now, here's where our history comes in as public health service. This fellow here, his name is Dr. Earle Phelps. He was the lead engineer working on this project. And as you can see in this inset from that report, Professor Earle B. Phelps of the United States Public Health Service was engaged as the Commission's consulting engineer and was put in charge of the investigation. I'm not sure how many of you know the name of Professor John Phelps, but I think a lot of you probably remember one aspect of his last name. He was a pioneer in developing methods to quantify water quality, including the dissolved oxygen curve. And that oxygen sag curve model is what engineers, primarily environmental engineers, if you're working with IHS, working in sewer facilities, are quite familiar with this. So he partnered with yet another PHS engineer, whose name was Howard Streeter, and they came up with the Streeter-Phelps equation. Now, as engineers, we think that's pretty cool. I don't know if other audiences would think so, but that's really neat, that we have, Public Health Service is responsible for the Streeter-Phelps equation. I did not know that as a practicing PE, practicing engineer. I was not aware of that until I became involved in the research in this project. And so with this model, the Streeter-Phelps equation did, as many of us know, is it helped determine the BOD, the biochemical oxygen demand impacts from these discharges in the water, which continues to be the basis of how we design our wastewater facilities and how we draw up permits for NIPD's discharges. So let's talk about the tribal community. As I mentioned before, they were divided because of the political boundary. These impacts to the tribes were huge. Starting with the logging tribes. The tribes used the river for navigation. They could not use it anymore during the logging drives. They could not fish. They could not get their boats into the water, as you saw in the previous photograph. Not only that, but they also fished in the water for sustenance. For years and years and years, thousands of years, this is what they used. They hunted and they fished. And you see here on the left the Maliseet family with a string of fish. They also used the river for drinking water, and they used it for ceremonial uses as well. So you can imagine the impacts of the industry that it had on the tribes. Now, this continued for many, many years. Industrial revolution continued, technology continued, and to add insult to injury, in 1960, the Mactaquac Hydro Dam was constructed on the St. John River. And this hydro dam was built without any consideration for fish passage. Here you see a photograph of the dam. But before it was built, it was planed here in the lower left, free-flowing river. And then it was constructed top left, under construction, and then final construction is the top right. And you can see there it creates a huge head pond, and it essentially blocks all fish from going up and down the river. So what were these impacts on the tribal lifeways? As I mentioned, the tribal community is a fishing community. So almost immediately, the passage of anadromous and diadromous fish, those who are born in freshwater, go out and spend most of their life in the marine environment and come back, snuffed out. And so this is only a number of species, but salmon is the keystone species. Alawite, shad, eel, lamprey, sturgeon, all of these are major fisheries that the tribes depended on. Not only that, but the huge head pond flooded out a number of Maliseet villages after it was constructed. So as you see here on the map, this is Fredericton, New Brunswick. The mouth of the river is here, the Bay of Fundy. This map pretty much cut off the fish at an early place. Such that, since that time, including the most recent year, it's only been a fraction of fish that have come back, particularly salmon. Only 400 salmon now are able to make it up because they don't have their habitat of the rest of the watershed. 400 fish out of thousands and thousands that the tribe once relied upon. The other point I want to make is those fish who were upstream and needed to go downstream, there was no passage downstream either, and so going through the turbines wasn't really great for them. Particularly the eels, which are really long, and the lamprey, which are really long, okay? So the species, all those species were really decimated. So, let's go 100 years further since Professor Phelps would start working on the river. To the present time, in 2016, the international conversation begins. The Holden Band of Maliseets, with whom we have a trust responsibility, requested EPA, they called me up, requested EPA to convene US and federal agencies, Canadian federal agencies, and the Maliseet First Nations, their sisters on the other side of the border, to convene a summit to discuss these impacts. And those are primarily fish passage, degraded water quality, habitat restoration. It took me years, and I think I'm still learning what this really means to the Maliseet people. This means everything to them. This is their culture. This is what they identify with. It's not simply another food source that they can go to the market and get something different. It's beyond that, and I can't say honestly that I yet fully comprehend that, but this is everything to them. Why do they come to EPA? Why didn't they go to, for instance, NOAA Fisheries? Well, it happens that NOAA Fisheries, while they want to be a player, they didn't be the primary agency because the species of salmon in the St. John River are not our endangered species, and they only work with our endangered species list species. And so we come to find out that NOAA really didn't have any authority officially to participate, although they are a player. We have an impact because we are responsible in EPA for administering the Clean Water Act. And under fairly recent promulgation, we have interpreted the Clean Water Act such that we have identified sustenance fishing as a designated use. If you know anything about establishing water quality standards, this is huge. And the BIA affirmed this by saying the tribes that have a right to clean fish also have a right to fish, also have a right to clean fish and access to fish. And so as a water quality standard, protecting and restoring sustenance fishing is something which we have interpreted as under our authority. And that's why we're part of this. And that's why we're proud to lead this investigation and this effort here. In 2017, about a year or so later, an international statement of cooperation was executed. And this was executed among the number of agencies you see here, from the US side, EPA, Fish and Wildlife Service, NOAA, USPHS, Army Corps of Engineers, Bureau of Indian Affairs, all came together. Holton Band of Maliseets, and then on the Canadian side, Environment and Climate Change Canada, Division of Fisheries and Oceans Canada, and then 6 First Nation Maliseet nations in Canada. All came together. Here's a copy of the signature page and the signing of this interim statement of cooperation. You don't see the whole document here, but it was a monumental effort to bring parties together to say, yes, this matters, and we want to put forth our efforts to do something. This is unprecedented, and it's something which I think could be a model for others. This is only an interim, and I'm going to get into where we're working now, but this is the first step in getting agencies to the table to talk about it. And not one agency can fix this. Not one tribe or First Nation can fix this. It's an international problem, and it takes an international effort. And so between 2016 and 2019, the present time, we've accomplished 4 major things. We've had 6 leadership summits among the agencies from the tribes and First Nations to discuss how we're going to approach this. We started off with figuring out the data. What data is out there? And the data in different data sets had to correlate, had to be harmonized, so that US data on the watershed had to be comparable with the Canadian data. And all of this data was collected in an effort to help us start to prioritize what makes the most sense on where we should restore first. What should we do? So it had everything from data layers of water quality to habitat restoration areas to agricultural land impacts, all the layers to collect that. We've also just come out with a storybook just last week at our last summit. I was in Maine. A storybook that helps decision makers figure out where those priority areas are to make it easier for leadership. We're also dealing with fish passage issues as well. The fish passage issue is huge. We can restore everything and set the table to the extent that we can upstream in the watershed, but fish passage remains a major obstacle. The dam that blocks these fish is managed by a Crown corporation, which is New Brunswick Power. It's government, but yet it is also a utility, which makes it very complicated. And as you can see, it was a huge dam. It is a huge dam, and fish passage will be very, very difficult to achieve. Not only if we can get the fish above the dam, but there's a huge head pond, which isn't the habitat for cold water species, because the head pond is huge and it warms up. There's also the issue of the downstream passage. Now, these many issues are still yet to be figured out. But we have brought in the expertise of the different agencies that have that expertise in the area to help us start on the path for figuring this out. And so what's ahead for this collaboration? As I said, we're going to try to set the table for the restoration of the fish. We're conducting a genomic study to figure out the genomics of each species, particularly of salmon, as they go up to the dam and can't go any further. We're going to assess the genetics because, interestingly enough, one salmon isn't the same as another. The Atlantic salmon is a generic term, broad term, but each salmon has a particular imprint, a genetic imprint, to a particular tributary, not even to a particular river, but a particular tributary within that river. And it knows where to go. Except salmon haven't just been through there in about 100 years, or 40 years or so. But nonetheless, it's still imprinted on there. So should we be able to address fish passage, they'll be able to go back. So we're conducting a really neat genomic study where we can support captive rearing, we can support egg production to help at least bolster the population within the watershed. And lastly, we're trying to reverse that damage. We're trying to do that by creating unfettered volitional fish passage using expertise across the board, the cultural input from the tribes and the First Nations. This is going to take a lot of political will, and it's going to take the work of everyone working together with this. And I'm going to end here. This is not a project where we can say it's all sealed, buttoned up, and tied up with a bow and it's done. This is a many, many, many years effort. But it's an example of how we can work collaboratively together in partnership. It takes political will, it takes negotiations, it takes the engineering expertise of solving problems and figuring out solutions to ultimately make this work. So I thought this was a great opportunity to share a little bit about this story and about the varied types of work that we can do as commissioned officers, particularly this one with EPA that I'm involved in. So I want to thank you, and I'm certainly open to any questions.
Mike, when you're looking at water quality, are you using US standards or the Canadian standards, or do you have to blend those?
Well, when we're working, our authorities under the Clean Water Act, obviously we're just on the American side. And so we have a duty to protect sustenance fishing and high water quality standards for the waters in Maine, in partnership with the state. However, the water quality data that we need to figure out where are because this is an international effort, we're not just going to restore our waters, but of course Canadian waters as well. Their water quality data, there's also data on that, but certainly it's not necessarily the same parameters. They do things a little bit differently, and it's a challenge of harmonizing that data together. So, other questions? Great, well thank you very much.